Beyond the question of what is happening in our nation lies the issue of why it is happening. Why, nearly 50 years after civil rights, do we see such grievous and troubling racial disparity in our country? Why, after all of our national progress, do we still live in a land where blacks are overrepresented in so many negative societal measures? Why are black Americans more likely to be involved in a homicide, live in poverty, drop out of high school, to be HIV positive, to be hungry, to be arrested, to spend time in prison than any other race or ethnicity in the country? This question begs our national attention and discussion. Well, someone says, I'm black and I'm not a homicide and in prison. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying black people are or white people are. I'm saying why is it so twisted in one direction? Implausible causes. The word implausible means these are not believable. I'm going to tell you some myths here and debunk those myths. Please don't think I'm saying the myths. I'm quoting the myths. There are several possible, though not necessarily plausible, explanations for the statistical and existential disparity we see happening in our land. Many people have proposed various ideas on the subject. I offer a simple summary of some of the more popular theories below. Here's a theory that some people believe, and a lot of people believe these first three. Blacks are genetically disposed to destructive patterns of behavior. It's in their DNA. A lot of people believe this. They're just hardwired to engage in unhealthy lifestyles and practices. There's just something wild and untamed about them. No matter how many positive opportunities are around them, they seem to be driven toward negativity. How else can you explain what's happening in black populations in nations all over the world? Here's my answer. This idea is one that only ill-informed and untraveled people espouse. First of all, despite the disparity shown in the statistics, the overwhelming, all caps, majority of black folks, just like white folks, live simple, productive lives. They rear their families and build their lives similarly to their white counterparts. The idea that the statistical disparity we observe is somehow related to genetic predisposition stems from a carefully crafted caricature, historic and modern, of blacks in our nation and the world. It relies on anecdotal, quote, evidence for, quote, proof of something that is nothing more than a generationally imparted fable. No logical person can embrace such a theory. Number two, here's a theory that some people believe. Blacks are less evolved than other races, and therefore, wherever there are higher concentrations of black people in a city and nation, you will see the patterns of uncivilized behavior more commonly. Furthermore, unless natural selection has removed the genetic inclination towards religion and superstition from a particular society or people, they will never fully escape these destructive patterns. Unlike their northern European counterparts, blacks the world over are still highly infected with the virus of religion. This, in America and abroad, is what bites at the heels of black progress more than anything else. Here's my response. This view, despite how many supposedly erudite or educated or learned people advocate it, is insulting and grotesquely ignorant. No logical person can embrace such a theory. Number three, here's a popular one. Black people are cursed by God. They are being punished because of the sins of their forefathers. You know, Noah and Ham and Shem and all generations and nations of black people will be cursed until the day the world ends. This is written in the Bible. This is why things are so bad in Africa and in any other place that predominantly black communities exist. No matter how hard they try, black people will never be able to change or to escape this. It will follow them everywhere. My response, such foolishness does not even deserve a response other than to say, no logical person can embrace such a theory. Number four, I've heard this from many members of our church. Well, I won't say many, a few in our church. It's wrong. Number four, the explanation for these statistics is simple. They are not true. These numbers are fabricated by our society in an effort to make black people look bad. They are all based on inaccurate research that is tainted and prejudiced by the prejudice of the researchers. These so-called facts are twisted and turned in every way possible to present a negative picture of black people and black society. From the research departments at major universities and editors at local television stations and newspapers, there's a grand conspiracy to fill our minds with lies about what is really going on. Here's my response. I can actually identify with the heart and hurt behind the voice in this point. When people see the statistics I presented here, they can easily assume that I'm attempting to make statements about, quote, black people. Nothing could be further from the truth. It's not possible for me or anyone to make a statement about a race of people. No one has a broom large enough to sweep any race or ethnicity into one collective societal pile. My objective in sharing these charts and graphs is to illuminate the overrepresentation in certain negative societal indicators by people that happen to be black. I have never, will never, and can never say that any racial or ethnic group is one thing or another. Neither can anyone else. Though the argument in point 4 is not accurate in application, it is actually not far off in premise. There is, in fact, a grand conspiracy of sorts, and it does hinge upon the words and images with which we have flooded our society about black folks for many generations. This conspiracy, however, is not being propagated in the manner that one may immediately assume. Nevertheless, for a person to claim that the statistical disparity is fabricated actually does great disservice to our progress as a nation. Incomplete solutions. People have offered some ideas. So what then is the cause of these statistical gaps? The answer is surprisingly simple. America is uneven as a nation. The ground of our land is sloped and slanted in ways that cause things like homicide and poverty to pool disproportionately in certain places among certain people, primarily among people that are black. Simply put, for some reason, back to the top of the page, no matter how much we reduce the crime rate, poverty rate, HIV rate, etc., we have yet to find a way to alleviate the overrepresentation of black people in those demographics. This does not bode well on our aim to be a shining model among the nations of the world. In my opinion, it's high time we start asking ourselves why this disparity exists and what we can do about it. There are many suggestions and solutions that are worth considering. A, the issue is not race, some have suggested. The issue is poverty and lack of education. Whenever you have low economic opportunity and poor educational resources, destructive behaviors and societal problems will be common. We should not introduce a racial context into a problem that's not racial at all. While I agree with this argument in principle, I feel that such logic is misguided at best and disingenuous at worst. It means it's not being honest. Education and poverty are important factors, but they do not address the heart of our national problem. It is true that wherever poverty is present and access to quality education is limited, certain societal indicators will follow, or often follow. To say that I've unnecessarily inserted a racial context into this conversation, however, ignores the fact that there is already a racial divide in the areas of poverty and education in our nation. If poverty and poor education are the problem, then we need to ask ourselves why blacks in our nation are constantly overrepresented in these two base indicators, as well as the things they supposedly beget. B, it's society's fault. There are so many blacks in our nation that are poor, from broken homes, with poor access to education, no role models, etc., that it's not surprising to see such statistical disparity. This is a societal problem. My answer, this disparity is indeed a societal problem, but only in the sense that we need to take responsibility as a society to address it. We need to be cautious, nevertheless, of misdiagnosing society as the problem until we really understand everything that diagnosis entails. First, let's be clear from the beginning. Not all black people come from the type of background described in point B. In fact, the overwhelming majority of blacks do not. They don't come from broken homes and crime and all this other kind of stuff. Furthermore, that a person, black or otherwise, comes from poverty, a broken home, etc., is no guarantee that he or she will engage in destructive behavior. There are far too many people, black and otherwise, that have come from such backgrounds that never sold drugs, robbed a store, stole a car, or committed a felony. Finally, there are far too many people from fine and decent backgrounds that have engaged in these endeavors to prematurely conclude that an individual's background is the sole cause of his or her life choices. C. So I'm going to say, why are you taking the time to do this? Because it doesn't matter what they say. I want the people that are connected to me to know what's really been said. C. All of this talk about causes is stupid. I've heard this from people in our church. We need to focus on the answers. I've heard this from black people in our church. Black people just need to stop all of the foolishness and killing. We don't need a national reformation or anything outside intervention. We simply need to stop, period. Oh, and we need to hold parents accountable. Black people need to do a better job at parenting their children. If they did, these type of statistics would disappear overnight or change overnight. Here's my response. This is a very popular theory that deserves our attention. We must begin by addressing the false premise upon which it is built. In truth, black people don't need to start or stop doing anything. To intimate such an idea is not only unfair, but also untrue. As difficult as it may be in our generalization-based modern world, we must resist the instinct to lump an entire race or ethnicity into one behavioral construct. It is impossible and inappropriate to do so. In addition, the suggestion that, quote, black people need to do a better job as parents is too sweeping of a generalization to hold merit. It does great insult and injury to the many fine parents, black and otherwise, who are bewildered by the behavior of one or more of their children, especially when it stands in stark contrast to the fruitful and productive lives that their other children are living. Even if the inefficacy of black parenting were the root of the issue, and I don't believe it is, we would still be left to explain why the supposed disparity exists between, quote, white parenting and black parenting. In other words, if we accept that wayward black children are the product of errant black parents, then we would need to ask why those parents are supposedly so inadequate in comparison to their white counterparts. We don't want to reintroduce points 1 through 3 into the conversation, so we therefore must dig deeper. There are some aspects to point C that can withstand scrutiny. I do agree, for instance, that any individual, black or otherwise, engaged in destructive behavior simply needs to stop. Dang it. Now, you can't see dang it in yours, but mine says dang it right after there. These individuals must change what they are doing, and they must do it post-haste. We cannot place the blame for violent or destructive actions anywhere other than where it belongs, squarely on the shoulders of the people engaged in it. Any person using a gun to commit a robbery, for example, needs to take full responsibility and be held fully accountable for his or her own actions. We cannot blame parents, society, education, poverty, etc. for an action that an individual decides to undertake. On the other hand, While I do believe that personal responsibility is the ultimate conclusion to our national conversation, we may be oversimplifying the issue if we begin with that idea. To suggest that people should simply, quote, stop doing what they're doing makes the flawed assumption that a person's actions are self-originating, or that what a person does occurs independently of how a person thinks. That is not true. If we can agree to begin our conversation with this fundamental idea, we may well be on our way to addressing some of our national unevenness. Here we go. What's the root of the problem? We know this. People's actions, whether they're good or bad, are direct result of their decisions. People's decisions, split second, singular decision, or even cumulative over time. They're an outflow of a person's mindset. People's mindsets, healthy or otherwise, are formed by the thoughts and feelings they most consistently nurture and embrace. People's thoughts and feelings, whether they're creative or destructive, are shaped by the words, images, and experiences upon which their souls fixate. These words, images, and experience, whether they're positive or negative, arise from somewhere in the dynamic gap between what our culture creates and what creates our culture. I am of the opinion that culture and the mysterious winds that fill its sails is the real culprit in our national dilemma. In this context, culture should be our real focus, not necessarily society. Culture is defined as the prevailing and celebrated attitudes, traditions, values, and practices shared among a group of people. Hear this. There is no such thing as black culture any more than there is white culture. There is simply culture. Any attempt to label specific attitudes, traditions, values, and practices as either black or white is a fruitless endeavor. It takes little more than an objective eye and a listening ear to discover just how much of what prevails and is celebrated amongst us, all race and ethnicity, is interspersed and universal. The marvelous thing about culture, and even what we call subculture, is that the adherents to the various cultural philosophies don't have to know each other or look like each other to be part of the same group. The only requirement to be part of the same culture or subculture is a similarity in the arrangement and prioritization of certain values, traditions, attitudes, and practices. As these branches of culture extend from the tree trunk of what is universal to most humans, like things like identity, security, safety, etc., we begin to see slight variations in the arrangement and prioritization of certain attitudes and values. As we venture even farther from the trunk, certain subcultures emerge as offshoots. On these smaller branches, we often see a more exaggerated rearrangement and deprioritization of certain values. You get out on the tiny branches, and attitudes towards things like violence, sexuality, social responsibility, personal accountability, human life, economic focus, etc., are vastly different on those little tiny branches than they are in that part of a cultural tree from those we find closer to the trunk. The people that occupy these cultural branches approach and respond to the world in a manner very different from the majority. These are neither black branches nor white branches. They are simply branches comprised of people with alternate ideals and norms. Like the branches of a tree, right there, half of that middle, right where the page breaks. Like the branches of a tree, the arrangement and prioritization of values within a culture or subculture must be nourished to be sustained. It needs to be fed. In short, if the attitudes, traditions, values, and practices of a culture are not nurtured, they will die off. Other than the base human priorities that drive us, things like identity, security, safety, connectivity, etc., every other value or practice we have is subject to change as either a means of cultural progress or regress. The way to sustain any culture or subculture is to feed it with words, images, and experiences that reinforce and bolster the attitudes, values, traditions, and practices within it. The way to weaken a culture, a prevailing or celebrated attitude and value, is to alter or weaken the words, images, and experiences that feed that culture. The more widespread, available, and acceptable the words, images, and experience that reinforce a culture, the greater the chances that culture has for survival. If these words, images, and experiences continue to flourish, the resultant thoughts and feelings will no doubt find a place to sprout. Mindsets, decisions, and actions are sure to follow. This principle has served to shape and misshape societies since time immemorial. In our nation, it is evident that people from all races and ethnicities are engaged in destructive and violent behaviors. Recent headlines reveal that no race or ethnicity is unrepresented in either perpetration or victimization. The shocking truth, however, is that despite its general absence from our national headlines, black adults and children are affected by these actions at alarmingly higher rates in our nation than any other race. Somebody say, what does that mean? We have a black Columbine and a black Sandy Hook in our country every week. Every week. Every week, black Columbine and black Sandy Hook. Every week. Not on the headlines, not at Flags at Half Staff, but every single week. Okay? See, what we have to ask ourselves is, what is the body count before the flags get lowered? 2? 3? 7? because it's happening every week. We'll talk about it. The shocking truth, however, is that despite its general absence from our national headlines, black adults and children are affected by these actions at alarmingly higher rates in our nation than any other race and ethnicity. We have already concluded that, quote, blackness, if such a thing exists, is not causing the disparity in certain communities, nor is, quote, whiteness, if such a thing exists, preventing it in others. What then is the cause? Whenever we see trends that appear to follow a racial or ethnic line, we need to look beyond commonality of race or ethnicity to the commonality of mindset present among the people creating those trends. If you consider these things long enough, you will eventually conclude that commonality of mindset is a more reliable predictor of behavior than commonality of race or ethnicity can ever be. Since there's no such thing as thinking or acting black or thinking or acting white, there's no such thing as that, we must ask ourselves why some mindsets seems to suspiciously pool among certain races and ethnicities in our nation. Furthermore, what forces and sources are causing and permitting and fostering the traction that certain thoughts and feelings seem to gain disproportionately among blacks versus white? What stream of words, images, and experiences, or lack thereof, is feeding the mindsets behind the homicide, prison, education, HIV, AIDS, and poverty statistics that are so desperately askew in our nation? This must be our principal focus if we hope to address our national disparity at the root.